Hello, everybody. I'm Christoph Loch, and I want to thank very much Lord John Browne for joining us today. He was, as the CEO of BP, a front runner in the oil and gas industry by introducing environmental concerns into the corporate strategy. Now he is no longer at BP, but he still has a variety of interests. For example, chairman of the Francis Crick Institute and the deputy chairman of Wintershall DEA, which is the world's largest privately held oil and gas company. Thank you very much, John, for being here with us for this conversation. We will do this informally. I will ask a few questions, and then we can have a conversation about the questions. Let's start with this one in the context of COVID. How is it for you to be under lockdown and interact with people online only? I do the same thing. Do you think we will see a lasting change in the way everybody works because of this?
Well, for me, it's been surprisingly productive. I've got used very much to having meeting only a few people physically. They're called Mr. Zoom, Mr. Blue Jeans, Mr. Teams, Mr. WebEx, Mr. Skype. Lots of systems, and they work very well. And I've been in contact with many, many people. I think the contacts have become much more efficient. They certainly all start on time and they finish on time. And people are very careful about interacting. I've chaired quite a few board meetings on remotely, and they do work. They do absolutely work. So for me, it's been fine, and I have the great privilege of having the space and capability to live reasonably well under lockdown. I'm very minded that a lot of people don't, and we need not to take sweeping generalizations that it works for everybody. And there is really a role, I think, for people to go to a place where they can mix with other people and have the social aspects of being in an office and so forth. I do, however, think this will change the way we work. I'm very struck with board meetings, for example, where you have to travel all over the world to get there. They're very expensive to organize. They cause chaos for the executive, trying to figure out what to do with the board. But actually, if you had 6 board meetings a year, why not have 4 of them digitally and 2 of them face-to-face? Maybe that's the sort of solution we'll get. Plus, I think there'll be a lot of people who said, rather than traveling across town for a meeting, why don't we just do it on one of the many platforms that we can use, because we can get the answer that way. So I think people will mix and match. I think it will improve the effectiveness of business significantly and probably improve its efficiency too.
That I have seen some of this, but it occurs to me as you're speaking that I find that sometimes you miss some implicit information in online meetings. You hear what people say explicitly and you see their facial expressions, but you miss informal clues from walking, for example, through the organization. Do you think that will limit the use of this to some degree?
Yes, it's not a panacea. I think it's it's an improvement in the way in which we do business. But social contact, reading body language, meeting people in an unscheduled way, all of these things, of course, are very important, because business is a social process. It's not just an economic process. I think the economics, the governance, we can handle very well, as we're doing at the moment. But there's another side to life which has to be handled elsewhere. But I think you can mix and match them, and you can use what's right for the right purpose here. These tools are here for us to use, not to direct what we do.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, maybe it's an opportunity to change to the oil and gas industry. So there is a bit of hostility around discussions to oil and gas, which we're seeing here in the university. because of its contribution to climate change. So maybe you could say something about how you think the industry can be part of the solution toward avoiding a climate scenario of 3+ degrees, rather than a part of the problem as it is sometimes seen today. Maybe you could give us your view on that.
Certainly. I think that I have, since 1997, believed very firmly that the oil and gas industry is part of the problem. It is creating a lot of carbon dioxide with the products it makes, and they are contributing to climate change. It's also part of the solution because it could decarbonize the hydrocarbons with technologies we have today, carbon capture and storage and use. It can also take some of the dollars that it is investing in things like oil production and add it to different forms of industry, which are different ways of creating energy, whether that is the production of electricity through renewables or the production of hydrogen through electrolysis or steam reforming with carbon capture and storage at the other end of it, different techniques. There are lots of things that can be done. Of course, the private sector, the oil and gas companies as we know today, need the permission of their investors to do that, because it is a diversification. And some investors may say, why don't you just actually liquidate what you've got and we'll go elsewhere. That really is something which every company needs a proper dialogue with its investors on. But that's one side of the equation only. Oil and gas companies. They are important thought leaders, and I think the tone they set is important in markets generally. But they're not a very big part of the stock markets. Now, they used to be 15%. Now they're well less than 5%, probably well less than 5%. So they're not a very important investment class, and they're not as important as they used to be in terms of generating dividends and cash for people. They are still important, but not as important. Mm-hmm. The biggest part of the oil and gas industry is not quoted companies, but it is state-owned enterprises. And I include in that partially quoted companies like Gazprom or Rosneft. They're clearly state companies in Russia and even Equinor in Norway, which is only partly quoted. But these are the companies that produce well over 80% of the world's oil and a very significant, probably about 70% of the world's natural gas. So these are the companies who are going to continue to produce, and they have a very different set of objectives. Their objectives, of course, are to add value to the patrimony of their country, which is the natural resources which lie underneath the country, whether they're oil, gas, or coal. And they will have to take a very different approach to the way of the future. Pressuring the quoted sector is, of course, what we do, what everybody does, and it's the right thing. But if you just shut down the private sector completely, chances are the oil and gas would still be produced by the state sector. So be careful what you wish for here, because they're not controlled. They are, of course, influenced, but not controlled. I like to think that the oil and gas sector, that it could be part of the solution if it really did the right thing, because it could influence the state sector. Doing the right thing is to apply the tools and techniques, the engineering we have today to clean up the products and to do that at speed. Now, there's one other thing that's missing. State companies, private companies, but the biggest actor here is governments. And governments have to move like every piece of innovation, if you will, and decarbonizing is an innovation at scale. Governments have to support innovation because it's very difficult for people to take the first risk. And so it's who takes the first risk. And that's why I think a lot of people still talk about, correctly, taxing carbon, putting a price on carbon, doing something which forces people to avoid putting it into the atmosphere and storing it away. That is the essential missing ingredient, and that will push the technology to come down in cost and to make it possible to apply. But we have a missing element here called government policy. And maybe, just maybe, certain types of these policies might be appropriate as we come through the economic mess that we have following COVID.
Thank you for that. We will come back, I think, in a couple of minutes to the question of the guidance role that governments might be able to play. But just to follow up now on the on what's happening in the oil and gas industry, we have seen a recent glut in oil and an unprecedented price collapse with actually negative value of term contracts. From a combination of demand reductions because of the COVID crisis, plus increased production by some producers, which we can doubt how wise that was. Now, do you think this will slow down the long-term move away from fossil fuels, or maybe hasten it? Or you just talked about technology, and I know that you are, for example, working on a new technology of producing hydrogen out of natural gas. Maybe fossil fuels can make a comeback, in a clean way, with technologies like this. So what do you think is going to happen to move out of fossil fuels in the near future?
Perhaps it's just worth talking a little bit about the supply and demand of crude oil at the moment. It was, in my mind, the seeds for the reduction in the price of crude oil was sown well before COVID. And the reason for that is that the production was artificially constrained even against normal demand patterns. And when that happens, normally something happens at the other side of it. This happened in 85, 86. Actually, Saudi were controlling the production of oil in 85. They eventually said they can't do that anymore. They opened the floodgates. The price of oil collapsed by 50% and actually stayed very low for 17 years, between $30 and $40 in real terms. It's not to say history doesn't repeat itself, but history does actually, but things do rhyme with history, to use a Mark Twain saying. So I think that we see here probably now a situation where demand is very, very low. It's 30% down. There's vastly too much oil on the market. It's very difficult to constrain it to the level needed, because that's 30 million barrels a day and promises to cut production around 10 to 11 million. So there's nowhere to put the oil. So someone's got to stop producing. They've just got to stop producing. Some of that will be, of course, economic. People will not be able to produce because it's because they lose money on every barrel. So that will be shut in production. But the moment the price goes up, it's not as if it's gone away. It'll come back. And even if the companies go bust, someone will still own those assets and they will revive. So don't imagine that they die forever, as it were. So prices will probably be a bit lower. We don't know for how long. And people argue that therefore that will take away the need for, or the incentive to produce energy through different means. But actually, I think it's the other way around. If the price is low, it is very difficult to invest in the oil and gas business. Even at the prices we saw before before COVID crisis, the returns have been terrible. And I've just mentioned that, again, it represents a very small piece of the stock market. So people are very reluctant to invest in the oil and gas business. And I would think they'll be even more reluctant if the price remains low. So I think that's the first point. So new production will probably not be forthcoming for a very long time in the hands of the private companies. And actually, you can make more money by investing in wind and solar than you can in investing in oil and gas. I think the second thing, though, is a much bigger issue, which is what has COVID-19 done to our understanding and appreciation of natural crises? And I mean by that, when nature does something, not presidents, prime ministers, or armies, but nature. And when nature does something, our response is very different. We have to think about how it affects the world, and we are thinking about that with COVID-19. Health is on the agenda, will probably never go off the agenda. Resilience and fragility is on the agenda, and I think will really be on the agenda for a long time. Climate change and the consequences of that, compared with COVID-19, would be vastly bigger and vastly bigger. And I think an appreciation that nature is not to be tampered with in a way that we are tampering with the atmosphere may become even more important. People will think twice about just exactly how much carbon they are using and how much they're putting in the atmosphere. If they can collect it, store it, avoid the emissions, that's fine. And that's what has to happen. Or whether it can be absorbed naturally by forests or land, that's also possible. But nonetheless, the net carbon that we put into the atmosphere has to be reduced. And I do think that the present situation, because of health, fragility, and resilience, which says supply chains have to be shorter, maybe you can generate energy closer to home, which is what renewables do for you, maybe that's big and lasting impact on the way we think and the way we develop policy.
Okay, now let's segue, to something that you hinted at a couple minutes ago, and this connects to your latest book that you just published, "Make, Think, Imagine: Engineering the Future of Civilization," where you demonstrate how systems engineering will be critical to understand and influence the complex structure of the local and global economies, and indeed civilization. I'm an engineer, so I have great sympathy for this viewpoint. I couldn't agree more. And one of the points you make is that the complex system cannot be revolutionized. It gets nudged along because there are so many interdependencies. And indeed, progress in the context of climate change has been glacial, and everybody is worried that we may not reach it. So as we do nudging and gradual changes, there needs to be somebody who sets overall priorities. If you don't have an overall priority, you will not be able to nudge your complicated global, technological, and economic system. And you said earlier something is missing. So who do you see could play a role in order to set some overarching direction, which more decisively gets us into a situation where our climate may not change in a way which makes civilization collapse around the year 2100?
I think my observation in all my business life is led me to believe not in global government. I think global solutions through a global institution are very rarely possible. So I think it is about the big trading blocs working separately, the United States, China, India, and countries that they influence, and Europe, of course. And I think each one will have to think about what it's doing, and maybe they eventually do link up. So I've been very interested in many of the proposals that have been coming through from some very distinguished and great Americans to Washington about taxing carbon, and using the tax proceeds for redistribution to the population to make sure that the taxation is not regressive. That is to say, it doesn't take a disproportionate percentage out of the household income of poorer people. And so I think there's a possibility there. It is accompanied by border taxes, which says unless you do the same thing and you want to import something into the United States, it will be equalized in taxation for the carbon content that it has. And that's the sort of thing that I think begins to make it possible to have a trade in carbon. It's not a free trade, it's a tariff-based system. But on the other hand, I think many people are moving towards, well, as the United States is, a higher tariff-based trade system at the moment. So I think that's just one example. Europe is trying to do something similar, I think. China has not said what it's doing, other than actually doing a lot to try and reduce the amount of carbon it is producing, substituting coal with natural gas and trying to get the efficiency of industry up. Efficiency remains a very important factor here. I'm very struck, for example, that some of the earliest applications in today's environment of interesting AI solutions is in efficiency, maintenance, preventive maintenance, self-maintenance, uptime, all these sorts of things, all of which actually reduce the amount of carbon generated by stopping and starting processes, or by keeping things running that don't need to be run just because you don't know when you need them. If you could figure it out, you don't need it. So the so-called spinning reserves for electricity and things like that. So there are plenty of engineering solutions. There really are. It's all a matter of the incentives in place to do that. And I think it comes back down to carbon. If you want to reduce carbon, then all the incentives have to revolve around carbon. They can't revolve around anything else. It's a fundamental principle, again, I think, of business incentive systems. You want to achieve something, measure it, incentivize. So that, I think, is really important. And I think some companies like Shell, like BP, for example, in the oil industry, are beginning to get there. They're saying, actually, we want to be accountable for the total carbon content without double counting of the products that we make. And that's a very sensible way forward and gives us a basis upon which to put in a more public policy incentive systems rather than simply corporate incentive systems.
That makes total sense what you're saying, and I think pointing to the big trading blocks makes sense. Now, my worry in this is that at the moment I don't see a willingness to collaborate across the trading blocks, which I think is in the way of achieving anything in the direction that you just pointed to. I'm really worried, but I'm not sure whether you would like to comment on that part.
Well, I think, as we take a snapshot today, certainly before COVID-19, it looked like the world was deglobalizing rather than continuing to globalize. And, plenty of people were now moving, in particular the US and China, the US arguing that China had taken advantage of a system and not paid back into that system, and therefore they needed to pay now through a tariff system. Quite how that works out remains to be seen. That there is no doubt that the world's structure is definitely changing. I think people are reluctant about supply chains, not just now for tariff and trade purposes, employment, unemployment, all the things that go into these debates, but also for resilience and fragility. So people won't necessarily apply long supply chains to the production of goods where they don't have to. There'll be a balance, I think, here. A balance, I think we redefine efficiency to include also resilience. And that means just in time, zero inventory, long supply chains probably are a thing of the past for some things that we make, not for everything. I'm not a great believer in saying it's all one way or all the other, but there certainly will be changes. Yeah. I think as to the trading systems of the world, we have to wait and see. I think there's a lot of change in the political system as the US has concluded that it is not wishing to be the total leader of the world, and that China has a very different approach to itself. It has to, of course, increase its the wealth per capita to keep going. And Europe is still trying to work out what it's going to do post this crisis. And I don't mean that as a pejorative statement. I genuinely believe that it has to think through what it is going to do, not least in the transfer of wealth from one nation to another.
Yeah. Yes, good. So now resilience could be a good thing. Now let's come back to the coronavirus. Do you see, you just said climate change is bigger than the coronavirus crisis, which I agree with. Do you see any lasting effects of the coronavirus crisis, which may change some industries? For example, travel industry, we are all looking at the cruise ships, that are not even allowed to berth. And on work habits, you hinted about that already a bit. For example, maybe business travel will reduce. Do you see any lasting effects that we will see from COVID?
Well, first, I think it's coming back to whatever we mean by this normal growth. I don't quite know how to define it, but everyone talks about it, but can't quite define it. But it's going to take us time to get back there. So I think during that process, I think all of us will think a lot. It's too early to tell, and I think also it's many people have drawn an analogy to COVID-19 and when we exit from it, it's like exiting a war. I think that's too extreme. I think the Second World War was a dramatic change, a dramatic call for reconstruction. This is not that. There will be some changes, without a doubt. Of course, travel. It'll take us time to either want to travel or be allowed to travel. I think people will be quite cautious in exposing themselves to health risks, either in crowded establishments or in a metal tube with wings on, going from A to B, or even public transport. So I think there'll be a lot of caution and people will be concerned until we understand much more about how COVID-19 is spread. I do remember as a gay man who was right in the middle of this HIV AIDS crisis, how long it took for people to understand what it was and how you didn't get it. It took Princess Diana to hold the hand of someone dying of AIDS to change people's attitudes. So there are plenty of attitude changes that will be both bad and good. I think people will, in business, redefine efficiency. There's no doubt about that, about whether we have zero inventory or just in time, long supply chains. I think people will redefine the workplace. It will be necessary. It is necessary to have a workplace, but how it's used and how remote discussions take place, I think all of that will change a lot. And I also think that people will, I think that a lot of people are cleaning house at the moment. They're sorting out drawers and cupboards and things like that. And certainly the people I've talked to, it struck them all that maybe they don't need quite everything that they see they've collected over life. So maybe there may be a change into a slightly more make-do environment. Certainly my friends in the fashion industry at the moment think that there will be big changes. The less you go out, the less high fashion you need. The more you need very basic things. And I think, you know, many industries who are criticized for waste, and that's one of them, will, I think, take this really to heart and begin to think about what to do to stop waste, to preserve wealth in that way.
Okay. Very good. So let me come to my last question, and that's a more general question about leadership. The times are, in a way, unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, for business leaders. You've served in executive positions as well as chairmanship of boards. Do you have any advice for business leaders who are between a rock and a hard place in responding to a COVID crisis while the demands on being more responsible, you know, maybe for the climate change are not going away? Do you have any reaction or advice for business leaders?
So I think one of the biggest things that leaders have to think through is how to make decisions with imperfect information. Information is never perfect, and actually advice is never perfect, and maybe advice which is born of experience that no longer is relevant. You know, for example, don't expose yourself to the press when you probably should do exactly that. Information is right, you have to collect it. Certainly science and engineering give you information, but you have to understand how to collect it well, test and analyze, and be cautious. Be cautious on how you read it, because it may not be what it is, what it says it is, until you actually get the right amount of information. So be very cautious. So I think leaders certainly today have a very complex, big problem they've always had in some ways, how to make a decision with imperfect information. But they have to make decisions. They absolutely have to make decisions. So they need to make them in a way which they are partly reversible, but they need to be clear about direction and objectives. If the objective is to reduce deaths, remember that objective. If the objective is to maximize the economy and everything else is secondary, you better be clear about that. So this is one where uncertainty, purpose is critical, and values. You know, what do you value most? And these are hard trade-offs. The economy or people dying? What is it that you really value, and how do you express that? And I think grown-up conversations are, and I do believe in the general public here, they understand that. They would appreciate it if everyone had that debate. What is that debate? So I think that's a very important thing leaders have to do. I think leaders need to recognize too that there were a lot of changes afoot before COVID. We were very concerned about the wealth gap. We were concerned about the proportion of profits going to capital rather than labor. You know, that's something that still is out there. We had great things happening. I mean, AI was improving efficiency. That will carry on. We had problems with privacy. That will be still with us. We have to worry about that. And we'll worry about it as we collect more data on the question of COVID. And we have great advances in biochemistry and medicine, all of which are being applied at very high speed. And I have great confidence in all that. And I say that in what I observe at the Crick Institute. But I equally recognize that no solutions in these areas are present until they're fully tested and they really work. Because it's not a good idea to have something that cures something but actually kills more people in the cure. So I think people have to measure all these things against uncertainty, purpose, and values. That's what leaders are there to do. It's a tough job, and it's a tough job because you can't be liked the whole time. Nobody likes a leader the whole time.
Right. You just mentioned in your answer a dizzying, complex set of phenomena that we need to look at. So the reminder, maintain a sense of your direction, sounds very simple, and it is yet so hard to do. So so thank you for that.
I think you have to, get up in the morning and sort of say to yourself, let me remind myself what I'm here to do. I remember when I was running BP, I had two things that I reminded myself about. Number one was to make life better for people by giving them heat, light, and mobility without damaging the environment. And number two, to provide 1/6 of all the pensions in the United Kingdom. And I remember saying, these are my objectives. Now, to get that done, there's a dizzying array of things that had to be done. Amazingly great people you had to recruit and get organized and get to work together. But in the end, that's what it was about.
All right. Thank you very much, Lord Browne. I really appreciate that you were willing to share some of your incredible experience. I hope that everybody has benefited from this overview of some very, very important topics that we need to look at today. And everybody can benefit from somebody of your experience and wisdom. So, Lord Browne, thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.